The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the abandoned warehouse where the group had gathered. The air felt thick with anticipation, the hum of distant traffic barely audible over their voices. Inside, the mood was electric. It was supposed to be just a game, a harmless way to pass the time. But as Sarah looked around, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Everyone was too eager, too excited. James, ever the instigator, flashed a grin as he set up the challenge, the stakes higher than ever. "It's just for fun," he said, but his eyes gleamed with something darker. "No one's going to get hurt." But the words didn't sit right with Sarah. She watched as her friends gathered around, laughing, exchanging challenges. They didn't know it yet, but tonight, the line between fun and danger would blur. As the game began, she could only wonder, what would it take for things to go too far? As Sarah stood there, watching her friends dive headfirst into the game, a part of her wanted to leave. But the peer pressure was strong, and she knew she couldn't back out now without looking weak. The rules had been set. Whatever happens, no one can back down. She caught a glimpse of James, his eyes gleaming with excitement, and she felt a chill crawl down her spine. His words echoed in her mind. "It's just a game." But the air around them felt wrong. There was a tension in the room that had nothing to do with the laughter or the adrenaline. She could almost taste it. Something dark was about to unfold. Sarah tried to push the unsettling feeling out of her mind as she focused on the game. But as the challenges started, each one more intense than the last, she felt herself slipping deeper into a situation she couldn't control. The rules were clear, but what they didn't mention was that the game was always changing, always shifting. No one had signed up for the kind of danger that was coming. And when one of them fell, everyone would know. This wasn't just a game. Things escalated quickly. What had started as a laugh turned into something else entirely. Someone fell, their body hitting the cold concrete floor with a sickening thud. There was no laughter now, only silence. The group stared, unsure of what had just happened. Was it an accident? Or was it something worse? Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the realization set in. This was no longer a game. The game had gone too far. The laughter had stopped. Now, there was only fear. Sarah looked around, her mind racing. Was anyone to blame for what happened? Or was it just an unfortunate accident? She couldn't answer the question, but the unease gnawed at her. She had a feeling that whatever happened next, the game wasn't over. In the days following the incident, Sarah couldn't shake the image of her friend lying motionless on the cold concrete floor. The sound of their body hitting the ground replayed in her mind like a haunting echo. Despite the initial shock, life around her began to return to normal, or at least it seemed that way. The group pretended everything was fine, but the tension between them was palpable. Sarah found herself staring at her phone, waiting for a message from James, wondering if anyone would admit to what had truly happened. Every interaction felt off. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with unspoken words. She needed answers, but the truth seemed so elusive. The police hadn't questioned anyone yet, but she felt something lurking beneath the surface. What if this wasn't an accident? What if someone had done this on purpose? She couldn't rest until she knew for sure. The next day, Sarah met up with her friend Ben. He'd been quiet, distant, ever since the game. As they sat at a cafe, Ben shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. "Do you think it was an accident?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben hesitated before shaking his head. I don't know," he admitted. "I think someone, maybe pushed it too far." Sarah felt her heart race. Ben had always been the cautious one, the one who questioned the group's reckless decisions. But hearing him say those words made her stomach churn. Could one of them have actually caused the accident? She thought back to that moment in the warehouse when everything had gone wrong. The tense silence after the fall. She knew something had changed in all of them after that night, but the question still lingered. Who was responsible? Days passed, and Sarah's suspicion only grew. Every encounter with her friends felt like walking on eggshells. No one spoke of the incident, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they all knew more than they were letting on. She spent hours scrolling through their social media profiles, looking for any hint of a clue, anything that might suggest what had really happened. And then she found it, a cryptic post from one of the other friends, a message that was both vague and unsettling. "It's not over yet, the game's just beginning." Sarah felt her blood run cold. What did that mean? Was it a warning, or a sick joke? Her hands trembled as she read the post over and over. The more she looked into it, the more certain she became. This wasn't just an accident. Someone had planned it. Sarah decided it was time to confront James. She couldn't keep waiting for answers, hoping someone would come forward. She met him at a park, the setting sun casting long shadows over the benches. James seemed calm, almost too calm, as they sat down together. "What happened that night, James?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Was it really just a game?" James avoided her gaze. "It was a game," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Nobody intended for it to go that far. But Sarah could see it in his eyes. The lie was clear, even if he refused to admit it. "You're lying," she said, her voice louder now. James' face hardened, and for the first time Sarah saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. The game wasn't just a game anymore. It was something far more dangerous. The confrontation with James left Sarah feeling more uncertain than ever. She had hoped for a confession, some kind of clarity, but instead all she got was more confusion. James had walked away without saying much else, leaving her with more questions than answers. As the night wore on, Sarah replayed the conversation in her head, trying to make sense of it. What had James been hiding? Was there more to the game than anyone was willing to admit? And why did it feel like someone was always watching her? Her instincts told her to dig deeper, to find out the truth no matter the cost. But she also knew that whatever she uncovered could change everything, maybe even destroy them all. The more Sarah thought about the night in the warehouse, the more she felt herself spiraling. The images of her friends, their faces filled with excitement and fear, haunted her. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something had gone horribly wrong. The guilt gnawed at her, making her question her own involvement. Had she ignored the warning signs? Could she have stopped it? It was clear that the game had been dangerous from the start, but once the challenge began, it felt like no one could back down. Sarah remembered the way the others had urged her to play along, how they had all been swept up in the thrill of it. But now, with one of their own in the hospital, the weight of what had happened was suffocating. No one spoke about it directly, but the silence between them spoke volumes. And with every passing day, Sarah could feel her own conscience getting heavier. The walls were closing in on Sarah, and the guilt was becoming unbearable. She couldn't go back to the warehouse, not after what had happened. She felt trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Every interaction with her friends felt like a reminder of her complicity, even if she didn't want to admit it. Then one evening, she received a text from Ben, a single sentence that made her stomach drop. "We need to talk." That was all. There was no explanation, no context. But it didn't matter. Sarah knew this conversation was coming. She had been dreading it, but she also knew that she couldn't hide from it any longer. She had to face the truth, no matter how painful it would be. She had to understand what had really happened that night, and why everything had fallen apart so quickly. The conversation with Ben didn't go as Sarah had hoped. Ben was clearly disturbed, his voice trembling as he spoke. "We all knew something was wrong," he confessed. "But none of us wanted to be the one to say it." He paused, staring at the ground, his hands trembling. "It wasn't just an accident, Sarah. Someone pushed it too far, and I think we all played a part in it." Ben's words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She had suspected it, but hearing him say it out loud was different. There was no going back now. They couldn't pretend it was an accident anymore. There was a deeper truth, something darker lurking beneath the surface. They had all been complicit in this tragedy, and now they had to live with the consequences. The conversation with Ben left Sarah feeling more conflicted than ever. As she walked home that night, her mind raced with questions. What now? How would they face what had happened? The game had begun innocently enough, but somewhere along the way, it had turned into something much darker. Sarah knew that it couldn't be undone, that they couldn't go back to how things were before. But what did it all mean? What were the consequences of their actions? The question lingered in her mind as she walked alone through the quiet streets, her footsteps echoing in the empty night. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, maybe even herself, was responsible for what had gone wrong. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that they all had their part to play. The question wasn't just who was responsible, but how far they were willing to go to uncover the truth. As Sarah lay in bed that night, the guilt weighed heavily on her. She couldn't stop replaying the events of that night in the warehouse. Every word, every moment felt like a sign she had missed. She had let herself get caught up in the thrill of the game, the excitement of the moment. But now it felt like that moment had cost them everything. She turned over in bed, trying to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was too busy, too consumed by the thoughts of her friends, those she had trusted. Could they be trusted now? Was there anyone left who wasn't hiding something? The darkness in her mind seemed to stretch further and further, consuming everything around her. She could feel the walls closing in, the truth slipping further away. The spiral of guilt wasn't just in her mind anymore, it was becoming her reality. The truth seemed to slip further out of Sarah's grasp with each passing day. As time wore on, the feeling that something darker had been lurking beneath the surface of that night, in the warehouse, began to take hold. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Each conversation with her friends felt more and more like a facade. But there was one thing Sarah knew for sure: this wasn't just a game, not anymore. As much as she tried to deny it, the game was being manipulated from the very beginning. The rules had been rigged, and she had been too naive to see it. When she thought back to that moment, when the tension in the room became unbearable, it all made sense now. Someone had orchestrated the events, pushing them all into the danger they had faced. Sarah's instincts told her that if she didn't dig deeper into the truth now, it might be too late to ever find out who was behind the manipulation. Sarah's search led her to an unexpected discovery. Among the papers, one document stood out, a set of instructions, hidden beneath the other scattered notes. It wasn't part of the original game they had all agreed upon. The handwriting was familiar, someone she knew. The rules had been altered deliberately, pushing them into the very situation that had ended in tragedy. Sarah's stomach turned as she read through the document, understanding for the first time that they had been playing someone else's game all along. The questions that had been nagging her now had a dark answer. The game was rigged from the start. But who was behind it? Who had orchestrated this? Was it someone within the group, or was there an outside force pulling the strings? Sarah was no closer to understanding the full scope of what had happened, but she knew one thing: the game was never just about fun. The realization hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. She had been played. The rules of the game had been twisted, manipulated by someone who knew exactly how far to push them. She felt betrayed, not just by her friends, but by the whole situation. As Sarah pieced together the timeline of events, it became painfully clear. This wasn't an accident. This was a calculated move, a game designed to push everyone to their limits. She could almost hear the voice of the person behind it all, watching from the shadows, knowing exactly how to make the pieces fall into place. Sarah felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly overtaken by fear. The person who had done this was still out there, and they weren't finished yet. The game was still going, and it wasn't over. The tension in Sarah's chest tightened as she sat across from James in a darkened cafe, the air thick with the unspoken truths between them. He had been distant lately, avoiding her calls, but now he was here, sitting across from her, his eyes avoiding hers. "You knew," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "You knew it wasn't just a game, didn't you?" James' gaze shifted, his face betraying a flicker of guilt. He didn't answer at first, but Sarah could see it in his eyes. He had known more than he let on. "It was supposed to be a way out," he muttered. "A way to make everything feel real for once." Sarah's heart dropped. This wasn't just about fun. It had been about something deeper, something much darker. James had been caught up in the thrill of it, but now, The weight of what they had all done was sinking in. The conversation with James left Sarah more disturbed than ever. She had thought she understood what was happening, but now it's all even more complicated. She had to get to the bottom of it. She had to confront her friends, everyone who had been involved, and demand the truth. But there was a part of her that was scared of what she might uncover. What if it was worse than she could ever imagine? What if the person behind the game wasn't just one of them, but someone with a much darker plan? As Sarah stood at the edge of the city's skyline, looking out over the night, she realized that whatever she discovered next would change everything. The game wasn't just a game anymore. It was a war. And she had no idea who the real enemy was. Sarah couldn't keep running from the truth. It had been days since her confrontation with James, and the weight of the revelations had started to settle in. She couldn't trust anyone, not anymore. The people she had once called friends seemed like strangers now, their faces filled with secrets. The walls had closed in, and there was nowhere left to hide. She had to confront them all, every single one of them. The game had gone too far, and now it was no longer just a question of guilt. It was about survival. If she didn't expose what had happened, the game would continue, and someone else would be the next victim. She had already lost so much, her trust, her innocence, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing herself as well. So she gathered her courage and set off to find the others, determined to put an end to the madness. The friends were gathered at the usual place, a quiet, forgotten part of the city where no one would bother them. Sarah stood in the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like a stranger among them now. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the past few days hanging over them. As she stepped into the room, the others fell silent, eyes shifting nervously. Sarah wasted no time. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "This game, it wasn't just a game, was it?" Her question hung in the air, and she saw the guilt flash across their faces. No one said anything at first, but Sarah could see it in their eyes. The truth was finally coming to light. They had all been complicit in something far darker than they had ever imagined. The room was thick with silence, as each friend avoided eye contact with Sarah. She had already laid the truth bare, and now, the weight of their collective guilt was pressing down on them. One by one they began to speak, each revealing bits of the story they had kept hidden for so long. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," Ben said, his voice trembling. "But when it started, we couldn't stop." Sarah listened as the others confessed, their words laced with regret. They hadn't planned for anyone to get hurt, but they had all known on some level that they were pushing the boundaries of what was safe. As Sarah pieced together their stories, it became clear they were all responsible in one way or another. The game had been rigged from the start, and they had all played their part. The confrontation reached its peak as Sarah's emotions boiled over. "You did this," she shouted, her voice breaking through the silence. "You dragged me into this mess, and now look where we are. Someone's hurt, and we're all to blame." Her anger surged, and for the first time she saw the other friends flinch. James, who had been the leader of it all, stood up, his face hardened. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought I could control it, but I couldn't." Sarah took a step closer, her chest heaving with emotion. "It's too late for apologies, James," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "You can't undo what's been done." The room felt smaller, suffocating. The air crackled with the tension of long-held secrets finally coming to light. As the last of the confessions were made, the room fell into an uneasy quiet. No one knew what to say next. Sarah had heard everything, and now there was nothing left but the harsh truth. She felt a heavy weight on her chest as the reality of their actions sank in. The game had destroyed more than just their friendship. It had shattered their lives, leaving nothing but the wreckage in its wake. And now, as Sarah looked around at the faces of her former friends, she realized something else. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The consequences of their actions would follow them forever. But for now, all Sarah could do was walk away. There was no turning back, no going back to how things were. The game had claimed them all. The aftermath of the game's revelation spread quickly, like wildfire. The truth was out, and now there was no escaping the consequences. The police had already shown up at Sarah's door, asking questions about the incident. Her friends had all gone into hiding, refusing to speak out, leaving her to shoulder the burden of what had happened. Sarah could feel the walls closing in around her. The guilt from the game's twisted rules still haunted her, but now there was a new feeling creeping in: fear. As the authorities closed in, she began to wonder if she had made a mistake by confronting them all. Maybe she should have stayed silent. The pressure of the investigation was taking its toll, and the truth she thought would set her free had only made her feel more trapped than ever. The weight of what was to come sat heavily on her shoulders, but there was no turning back now. Sarah's days became a blur of questioning, interrogation, and mounting pressure. She hadn't slept in days, her mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. The police had questioned her multiple times, and each time she told them the same story, trying to stick to the truth. But every time she spoke, it felt like another part of her was being ripped away. She knew that the game's consequences weren't going to stop with the investigation. The more the police dug into the details, the more it became clear. Everyone who was involved had played a role. No one would escape this unscathed. Sarah could see the fear in her parents' eyes as they tried to protect her, but she knew it wasn't enough. The authorities were relentless. It wasn't just about the game anymore. It was about everyone's survival. It wasn't just the police who were closing in on Sarah. Her friends, once so close, had begun to turn on her. The phone calls and messages had stopped coming. They were no longer offering support. They were avoiding her. It was as if they had erased her from their lives completely. She had become a pariah among them, the one who had uncovered the truth and forced everyone to confront it. It hurt more than she expected, but Sarah didn't have time for self-pity. She had been right all along. They had all played a part in the game's twisted rules, and now they were all paying the price. The isolation was suffocating. Sarah was alone in this, and she had to face the consequences of their actions on her own. One night, after days of silence, Sarah received a message from Ben. It was short and cryptic: "We need to talk." The message was a lifeline, a flicker of hope in an otherwise bleak existence. Sarah's heart raced as she replied, arranging to meet at an old cafe they used to frequent. When she arrived, Ben was already there, sitting at a table, looking more worn down than she had ever seen him. He didn't say anything at first, but the sadness in his eyes spoke volumes. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "We've lost everything, haven't we?" Sarah nodded, her throat tight. They had been caught in a game that had spiraled out of control, and now they were both paying the price. The words, "We lost everything," echoed in her mind, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't alone. The conversation with Ben was just the beginning. Sarah realized that she couldn't move forward without understanding everything, every last piece of the puzzle. The game wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everything they had lost. The truth was out, but the fallout was only beginning. As Sarah left the cafe, she felt a strange sense of resolve. She couldn't undo what had happened, but she could take control of what came next. No matter how painful it might be, the game had changed them all. It had fractured their lives, their friendships, and their trust in each other. But Sarah wasn't going to let it break her. Not yet. Months had passed since the game ended, and Sarah had tried to move on. The world outside seemed to have continued without her, indifferent to the destruction that had rippled through her life. She had disconnected from everyone, her friends, her family, even her own past. The weight of it all still hung on her shoulders like a dark cloud, one that wouldn't dissipate, no matter how hard she tried to push it away. The memories of the warehouse, of the game, of the lies, everything had woven itself into the fabric of her being. The questions, the doubts, and the guilt remained in her mind, like a constant hum. But now, as Sarah looked at the world around her, she realized that she was no longer the person she had been. She had been irrevocably changed. The game had taken everything, but it hadn't taken her will to survive. It hadn't taken her strength. Sarah's new life had become one of quiet isolation. She had distanced herself from the people who had once meant everything to her. No phone calls, no messages. The only constant in her life was the emptiness of her apartment and the haunting memories that refused to let go. She couldn't bring herself to forgive those who had played a part in the game's destruction. Each day was a reminder of the past, a shadow looming over her every step. But even in the silence, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace. She had come to terms with the fact that the past was something she could never change. And as painful as it was, she knew she had to keep moving forward, no matter how impossible it seemed. The truth had been uncovered, and she was left standing in the aftermath, unsure of what came next. One evening, as Sarah sat alone in her apartment, a knock at the door startled her. She hadn't expected company, and the sudden sound made her heart race. As she opened the door, she saw a familiar face standing in the doorway. Ben. He looked just as worn out as she felt, his eyes filled with regret. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them said everything. Finally Ben spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I've been thinking about what we lost, about everything we did." Sarah's heart clenched at his words, but she didn't know what to say. It was too late for apologies, too late for reconciliation. They had all been complicit, and no amount of regret could undo what had been done. But as Ben stood there, the old bond between them flickered for a moment. It was fleeting, but it was enough to remind her that, despite everything, they were still human. They had all lost, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could begin to heal. As the days passed, Sarah realized that healing wasn't going to come quickly, and it certainly wouldn't come without effort. She began taking small steps toward rebuilding her life, one decision at a time. She reconnected with her family, her mother especially, who had always been there for her, even when Sarah had shut her out. Slowly but surely, Sarah started to reclaim pieces of herself, though the scars of the past remained. She couldn't erase what had happened, and she wouldn't try. But she could learn to live with it, to build a life in the shadow of what she had lost. It was a hard journey, but she knew she wasn't alone in it. Ben's visit had reminded her that there were people who cared, even if it seemed like everything had been lost. And that perhaps was the first step toward finding peace. Sarah had come to terms with the truth, but the hardest part was still ahead of her. Moving on wasn't something that happened overnight. The consequences of the game would follow her forever, but she was learning to live with it, to take each day one step at a time. The hardest part of surviving wasn't just facing the truth, it was accepting it and learning to live in a world that would never be the same. As Sarah stood at the edge of a cliff one final time, looking out at the horizon, she could feel the weight of the past lifting slightly. The authorities had stopped following her. The whispers of her former friends had quieted. It was as if everything had finally come to a conclusion, and now it was time for her to step into the unknown. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going.